The words hit like a slap across the face, echoing through the stale air of courtroom 6A. Another one who thinks she's special. Let me guess. You're going to tell me this is all a big misunderstanding? Judge Cassandra Blackwood's voice dripped with practiced contempt as she looked down at the black woman standing before her bench. Maya Thornfield kept her hands clasped behind her back, her dark eyes steady despite the courtroom packed with hostile faces. Look at me when I'm speaking to you. Do you understand the charges against you? Assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, disturbing the peace. Quite a rap sheet for someone who claims to be just a cleaning lady. The snickers from the gallery were audible. Detective Rex Aldridge shifted in his seat behind the prosecution table, his thick fingers drumming against the polished wood. His story was airtight. This woman had attacked him during what should have been a routine questioning. He had the bruises to prove it. Maya's voice, when it came, was calm and measured. I understand the charges, Your Honor. What I don't understand is why Officer Aldridge's body cam footage from the incident has mysteriously disappeared. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Prosecutor Sterling Whitmore's pen stopped moving across his legal pad. Equipment malfunctions happen. What doesn't happen is people like you getting to lecture this court about evidence. Maya tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. But if anyone had been watching closely, really watching, they might have noticed something unsettling in her stillness. The quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what cards everyone else was holding. The lock clicks twice, then silence. 3 weeks earlier, Maya Thornfield arrived at the Metro District Courthouse at exactly 5:47 a.m., her custodial cart squeaking softly as she wheeled it through the employee entrance. The security guard barely glanced up from his crossword puzzle. Just another invisible worker in a building full of invisible workers. Maya's morning routine was methodical, precise. She checked the same corners in the same order, emptied trash bins with systematic efficiency, and observed everything with the disciplined attention of someone trained to notice details others missed. Her movements were measured, controlled, habits that suggested military or law enforcement background, though anyone watching would simply see a dedicated cleaning lady doing her job thoroughly. "Morning, Maya," called court stenographer Beth Morley as she hurried past with her coffee and case files. Beth was one of the few courthouse employees who bothered to learn custodial workers' names, a kindness that Maya genuinely appreciated. "Morning, Ms. Morley. Running late today?" Judge Blackwood moved up the Henderson hearing. "Poor kid's been in holding for 3 months waiting for trial." Maya continued dusting the lobby area, but her ears tracked every word. The Henderson case. 22-year-old Marcus Henderson, charged with armed robbery based on witness identification that grew less certain with each passing week. Maya had been watching this case develop through courthouse gossip and overheard conversations. By 7 a.m., the courthouse was stirring to life. Court clerk Janet Pike arrived with her usual air of harried importance, immediately beginning her morning ritual of making the building's operations as difficult as possible for anyone she deemed beneath her station. "You there, cleaning person," Pike called to Maya. "The bathrooms on the 3rd floor better be spotless today. Judge Blackwood specifically mentioned them yesterday." Maya nodded politely, though she knew Pike was lying. Judge Blackwood never mentioned bathroom conditions. Pike simply enjoyed exercising petty authority over custodial staff. "Of course, Ms. Pike. I'll pay special attention to the 3rd floor facilities." Pike studied Maya with suspicious eyes. There was something about the way this cleaning woman spoke. Too articulate, too composed. Most custodial workers stammered or avoided eye contact when addressed by court staff. Maya did neither. "How long have you worked here again?" 18 months, Ms. Pike." "Funny. I don't remember you being so talkative when you started." Maya smiled pleasantly. People tend to become more comfortable in their environment over time. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, but Pike's instincts were telling her something was off. She couldn't articulate what, exactly. Just a feeling that this cleaning woman was more than she appeared. What happens when the system you trust becomes your biggest threat? This courtroom drama will show you how one woman's quiet strength exposed decades of corruption. Don't miss what happens next. Like this video if you believe justice should be blind, not biased. Maya's first significant interaction with the courthouse's power structure came during her 2nd week on the job. She was cleaning near Judge Blackwood's chambers when she overheard a conversation that wasn't meant for public consumption. "The Morrison case needs to disappear," Judge Blackwood was saying to someone Maya couldn't see. "Too many inconsistencies in the evidence. If it goes to trial, questions will be asked." "What about the defendant's rights?" came another voice, younger, uncertain. "The defendant waived his rights the moment he decided to commit a crime in my jurisdiction. Find a procedural error. Claim the search was invalid. Whatever it takes to make this go away quietly. Maya continued her work, but every word was being mentally cataloged. This wasn't judicial discretion. This was evidence tampering disguised as legal strategy. Judge Blackwood was protecting someone, and an innocent defendant was paying the price. The conversation ended abruptly when bailiff Marcus Steele noticed Maya's presence near the chambers. "What are you doing here?" His voice carried the automatic suspicion that courthouse security applied to anyone who didn't belong to the legal fraternity. "Emptying trash bins, sir. It's on my scheduled route." Steele studied her face as if memorizing it for future reference. "Be more careful about where you clean and when. Some areas are off limits during certain hours." "Of course. I apologize for any disruption." Maya's apologetic tone was perfect, respectful but not servile, acknowledging authority without surrendering dignity. But Steele's expression suggested he found something troubling about her composure. Over the following weeks, Maya established herself as a model employee. She arrived early, worked efficiently, and maintained the kind of professional invisibility that allowed her to observe the courthouse's daily operations without interference. But she was also gathering intelligence with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained in surveillance. She noticed that certain defendants received expedited hearings while others languished in holding for months. She observed that plea bargain negotiations followed predictable patterns based more on defendants' race and economic status than on the strength of evidence. Most significantly, she documented the informal network of relationships that determined outcomes before cases ever reached trial. Court Administrator Lila Fairwind was the spider at the center of this web. Officially responsible for scheduling and administrative coordination, she wielded influence that extended far beyond her job description. Maya watched Fairwind manipulate court calendars, influence jury selection, and coordinate with prosecutors to ensure favorable outcomes for preferred parties. "The Patterson case needs to be moved to Judge Hernandez's court," Fairwind told her assistant during a conversation Maya overheard while cleaning nearby offices. "But it's already assigned to Judge Thompson. Judge Thompson is too unpredictable. Judge Hernandez understands the importance of consistency in sentencing." Maya understood the code. Judge Thompson occasionally acquitted defendants when evidence was weak. Judge Hernandez could be counted on to convict regardless of circumstances. Cases were being shuffled to ensure predetermined outcomes. The incident that would ultimately expose Maya's true capabilities began with what should have been a routine interaction. She was cleaning the courthouse parking garage during her lunch break when she witnessed Detective Rex Aldridge questioning a teenage suspect without following proper procedures. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, pressed against a concrete pillar while Aldridge loomed over him with practiced intimidation. "I know you were there, Deshaun. We got witnesses placing you at the scene. You make this easy on yourself and tell me what I want to know, or we do this the hard way." Maya continued emptying nearby trash containers, but positioned herself where she could observe the interaction. No Miranda warnings had been given. No parent or guardian was present. No attorney had been contacted. Every aspect of the interrogation violated established procedure. "I told you I wasn't anywhere near that store," the boy said, his voice cracking with fear. Aldridge stepped closer, using his physical presence as a weapon. "See, that's where you're wrong, because I got video footage that says otherwise. And if I have to waste time proving what I already know, that's going to make me very unhappy." The threat was clear, and Maya recognized it as textbook intimidation. She had observed Aldridge's methods before, always aggressive, often illegal, consistently effective against suspects who didn't understand their rights. Maya made a decision that would change everything. "Excuse me, officer," she said, her voice carrying just far enough to interrupt the interrogation. Aldridge's head snapped around, his face darkening with irritation. "What?" "That young man should probably have a parent or guardian present during questioning, and Miranda warnings are required before custodial interrogation." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Maya had just cited legal procedure with the precision of someone who understood constitutional law from the inside. For a custodial worker to possess that knowledge was unexpected enough to be suspicious. "Lady, this is police business. You need to mind your own affairs and move along." But Maya didn't move. Instead, she took a step closer, her posture suggesting calm determination rather than deference. Constitutional rights are everyone's business. The Fifth and Sixth Amendments don't stop applying just because it's inconvenient. Aldridge released the teenager's arm and turned his full attention to Maya. She had crossed a line that civilian observers weren't supposed to cross, challenging police authority with specific legal knowledge. "You questioning my methods? I'm questioning your adherence to established procedure. Miranda versus Arizona, 384 U.S. 436. Custodial interrogation requires constitutional warnings before proceeding." The citation was delivered with casual precision, As if Maya quoted Supreme Court precedent every day. A murmur of surprise went through the small crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation. "How about you show me some identification, smart mouth?" Maya reached into her pocket and produced her courthouse employee badge. Aldridge studied it with exaggerated suspicion, looking for any excuse to escalate the situation. "Maya Thornfield, custodial services, 18 months on the job." He looked up at her face with predatory interest. Funny how a janitor knows so much about police procedure. "Education is available to everyone, Detective Aldridge. Constitutional law isn't classified information." The response was delivered with such calm authority that it momentarily silenced the gathering crowd. Maya wasn't cowering or backing down. She was asserting her knowledge with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what she was talking about. Speaking of legal procedures, protecting your rights starts with knowing them. Legal Shield offers 24/7 access to lawyers who can guide you through any legal situation. From traffic tickets to serious accusations, you'll never face the system alone. Visit LegalShield.com to get your first consultation free. Because everyone deserves proper legal representation, regardless of their background. The teenager used the distraction to slip away, disappearing into the courthouse through a side entrance. Aldridge noticed his departure and his face flushed with anger. "Now look what you've done. That suspect is gone because of your interference. That young man exercised his right to leave when he wasn't formally under arrest. Perhaps if proper procedures had been followed from the beginning, the situation wouldn't have escalated." Maya's response was professionally calm, but Aldridge heard it as insubordination. In his 15 years as a detective, civilians didn't lecture him about proper procedure. They certainly didn't quote constitutional law or challenge his authority in front of witnesses. "You know what? I think you need to learn about respect for law enforcement. I have great respect for law enforcement that operates within constitutional boundaries." The carefully worded response was like gasoline on a fire. Maya wasn't just questioning Aldridge's methods. She was implying that he had violated his oath of office in front of witnesses, with specific legal citations. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." On what grounds? Interfering with a police investigation, obstruction of justice, public disturbance. I can think of more if you give me time. Maya remained perfectly still, weighing her options. She could end this confrontation immediately by revealing her true identity. FBI Special Agent Maya Thornfield had the authority to arrest Aldridge for civil rights violations, but that would compromise 18 months of careful investigation. Instead, she made a calculated decision that would put her directly into the system she was investigating. "If you're placing me under arrest, I request that you follow proper procedure and inform me of my constitutional rights." Aldridge's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You want procedure? Here's your procedure." He grabbed Maya's arm with unnecessary force, spinning her around and pressing her against the concrete wall. The impact was sharp enough to echo through the parking garage. "You have the right to keep your mouth shut. You have the right to learn your place. Anything you say will be used to make your life as miserable as possible." It was a mockery of the Miranda warning, delivered with sadistic pleasure. Maya felt the cold metal of handcuffs biting into her wrists as Aldridge applied them with deliberate tightness. But she also felt something else: vindication. Every word of this encounter was being recorded by sophisticated surveillance equipment that would provide irrefutable evidence of constitutional violations. "Detective Rex Aldridge, badge number 4729, she said clearly, ensuring the recording captured his identification. "Shut your mouth," he snarled, but the legal damage was already done. Word of Maya's arrest spread through the courthouse community with the speed of wildfire. By the next morning, everyone from judges to janitors had heard about the cleaning lady who thought she was a lawyer. The reaction split predictably along racial and class lines. Court Administrator Lila Fairwind wasted no time in weaponizing the incident for maximum social damage. During the morning staff briefing, she made sure everyone understood the official narrative. Yesterday's incident in the parking garage is a perfect example of what happens when people step outside their designated roles, Fairwind announced to the assembled courthouse employees. Custodial staff are here to clean, not to interfere with police operations or lecture officers about procedure. Maya sat in the back of the meeting room, her wrists still bearing faint marks from Aldridge's handcuffs. She had been released on her own recognizance pending arraignment, but her arrest had fundamentally altered her status in the courthouse hierarchy. Some people seem to think that watching legal dramas on television makes them qualified to practice law, Fairwind continued, her eyes finding Maya's face in the crowd. Let me be clear, it doesn't. The humiliation was deliberate and systematic. Fairwind was using her administrative authority to ensure that Maya would be socially isolated, professionally ostracized, and personally demoralized. It was a classic power play designed to put an uppity subordinate back in her place. But Maya's response surprised everyone. She stood up calmly and addressed Fairwind with professional composure. Ms. Fairwind, with respect, citing constitutional law isn't practicing law. It's exercising citizenship. The Supreme Court has consistently held that knowledge of one's rights is fundamental to democratic participation. The room fell silent. Custodial workers weren't supposed to reference Supreme Court holdings in staff meetings. They weren't supposed to challenge administrative authority with legal precedent. They weren't supposed to demonstrate the kind of sophisticated understanding of constitutional principles that Maya was displaying. "Ms. Thornfield," Fairwind said, her voice tight with barely controlled fury, "you are here to empty trash bins and mop floors. You are not here to provide legal commentary or constitutional analysis. I'm here to do my job professionally and ethically. If witnessing violations of civil rights is inconsistent with custodial duties, then perhaps the problem isn't with custodial staff." The response was delivered with such calm authority that several courthouse employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Maya wasn't backing down or apologizing. She was doubling down on her position with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what she was talking about. Bailiff Marcus Steele decided to inject himself into the confrontation with the kind of physical intimidation that usually ended such discussions quickly. "Thornfield, you need to learn when to keep your mouth shut. This attitude is going to get you in serious trouble." Maya turned to face Steele directly, her posture suggesting readiness rather than submission. "Is that a threat, Bailiff Steele?" "It's friendly advice from someone who understands how things work around here." "And how do things work around here?" The question was posed with genuine curiosity, as if Maya was conducting an ethnographic study of courthouse power dynamics. Steele found himself momentarily speechless, unsure how to respond to someone who refused to be intimidated. "People know their place," he said finally. "And what place would that be?" Maya's follow-up question hung in the air like a challenge. She was forcing Steele to articulate the unspoken hierarchy that governed courthouse operations, a hierarchy based more on race and class than on law or justice. "You know what I mean," Steele said, unwilling to state his prejudices explicitly. "I'm afraid I don't. Could you be more specific about what knowing one's place means in the context of constitutional rights?" The conversation had become a master class in intellectual jujitsu. Maya was using Steele's own words against him, forcing him to either defend indefensible positions or retreat from his intimidation attempt. Every person deserves equal treatment under the law, regardless of race or background. If you've ever felt the system was stacked against you, this story will resonate deeply. Hit that subscribe button to see more stories where the underdog gets their day in court. The social consequences of Maya's stance became apparent throughout the day. Some courthouse employees began treating her with open hostility, whispering when she passed and deliberately making her work more difficult. Others, however, began looking at her with something approaching respect. Court reporter Beth Morley approached Maya during lunch break with an expression of curious admiration. "Maya, can I ask you something? Where did you learn to talk like that? The way you handled Fairwind and Steele this morning was incredible." Maya chose her words carefully. "I believe in education, Miss Morley. Knowledge is power, especially for people who don't have other forms of power. But that wasn't just general knowledge. You were citing specific legal cases and constitutional principles. That's pretty sophisticated stuff for someone who cleans toilets for a living?" Morley blushed. "I didn't mean it that way. I know you didn't. But that assumption, that custodial workers can't understand constitutional law, is part of the problem. Intelligence doesn't depend on job title." The conversation was overheard by several other employees, and Maya's reputation began evolving from troublemaker to mystery. People started wondering who she really was and how a cleaning lady had come to possess such detailed knowledge of legal procedure. Public Defender Iris Kane was particularly intrigued. She approached Maya after court session with the directness of someone accustomed to cutting through pretense. "Maya, I've been practicing law for 2 years, and I don't know half the cases you quoted this morning. Either you're the most educated custodial worker in history, or you're not who you appear to be." Maya met Kane's gaze directly. "What do you think I am?" "I think you're someone with formal legal training who ended up in custodial work for reasons I don't understand. Maybe a paralegal who lost her job. Maybe a law student who couldn't finish school. But you're definitely not just a cleaning lady." It was closer to the truth than Maya was comfortable with, but still far from her actual identity. "Does it matter?" The constitutional principles I cited are equally valid regardless of who speaks them. It matters because if you really understand law the way you seem to, you could help people. There are defendants in this courthouse who get railroaded because they don't understand their rights. Someone with your knowledge could make a real difference. Maya felt a pang of recognition. Kane's frustration with the system's inequities mirrored her own motivations for accepting this assignment. Here was someone who still believed in justice despite daily evidence of its absence. What would you want me to do? I don't know yet, but there's something wrong with this place and you seem to see it more clearly than most people. The professional consequences of Maya's confrontation with Detective Aldridge became apparent when Prosecutor Sterling Whitmore decided to test her legal knowledge publicly. During a break in court proceedings, he approached her with the calculated casualness of someone setting a trap. Ms. Thornfield, I understand you have strong opinions about police procedure. Maya looked up from her cleaning cart with polite attention. I have respect for constitutional requirements, Mr. Whitmore. Constitutional requirements. Yes, you mentioned Miranda rights yesterday. Tell me, are you familiar with the public safety exception to Miranda? It was a sophisticated legal question designed to expose the limits of Maya's knowledge. The public safety exception was an advanced concept that most lawyers struggled to apply correctly. Whitmore was confident that a custodial worker, regardless of her educational pretensions, would be stumped. Maya's response shattered his confidence. New York v. Quarles, 467 U.S. 649. The public safety exception allows officers to question suspects without Miranda warnings when there's an immediate threat to public safety. However, the exception is narrowly construed and doesn't apply to general investigative questioning. Whitmore's face went pale. Maya hadn't just known the case. She had cited it correctly and explained its limitations with the precision of someone who understood its practical applications. How do you know that? Constitutional law is publicly available information, Mr. Whitmore. The Supreme Court publishes its decisions for everyone to read. But knowing how to find specific cases and understanding their practical applications requires legal training. Maya tilted her head slightly, as if considering the observation. Or it requires careful reading and genuine interest in justice. Not everyone who understands law went to law school. Whitmore studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Everything about Maya's response suggested formal legal education, but her explanation was plausible enough to create doubt. What other cases are you familiar with? Maya recognized the challenge and decided to demonstrate the depth of her knowledge without revealing its source. Terry v. Ohio for stop and frisk procedures. Mapp v. Ohio for exclusionary rule applications. Brady v. Maryland for prosecutorial disclosure obligations. Gideon v. Wainwright for right to counsel. Should I continue? Each case citation was delivered with casual precision, as if Maya was reciting a shopping list rather than demonstrating mastery of criminal constitutional law. Whitmore's expression shifted from skepticism to concern. Where exactly did you study law? I didn't study law, Mr. Whitmore. I studied the Constitution. There's a difference. The distinction was both accurate and evasive. Maya had indeed studied constitutional law extensively, as part of her FBI training and her law degree from Georgetown University. But Whitmore didn't need to know those details. Court cases and legal troubles can destroy your finances overnight. That's why Allstate Legal offers comprehensive legal expense insurance. Whether you're falsely accused or need to defend your rights, Allstate Legal covers attorney fees, court costs, and expert witnesses. Get a free quote at allstatelegal.com and protect yourself before you need protection. Word of Maya's legal sophistication spread quickly through the courthouse's professional community. By afternoon, several attorneys had approached her with questions that tested her knowledge of procedural rules and constitutional principles. Defense attorney Thomas Wright was particularly impressed by Maya's understanding of evidence handling procedures. You mentioned Brady obligations earlier, Wright said during an impromptu conversation near the law library. Are you familiar with the materiality standard? Brady requires disclosure of evidence that is favorable to the defendant and material to guilt or punishment. Materiality is determined by whether there's a reasonable probability that disclosure would have changed the outcome. Wright's eyebrows rose. That's a perfect statement of the rule. You could teach evidence law with that level of precision. Understanding rules and teaching them are different skills, Mr. Wright, but understanding them at your level suggests formal training. I've seen law students who couldn't articulate Brady standards that clearly. Maya continued organizing legal files with practiced efficiency, but her mind was working tactically. Too many people were noticing inconsistencies in her cover story. Her knowledge was becoming a liability rather than an asset. Maybe I just pay attention when justice is at stake. Justice. Wright repeated the word thoughtfully. What's your definition? Equal application of law regardless of race, class, or social status. Due process for everyone, not just people who can afford expensive attorneys. The response was delivered with quiet passion that suggested personal investment in the principles she was articulating. Wright studied her face with growing curiosity. You know, there's something about you that doesn't add up, Maya. The way you speak, your knowledge of legal procedure, your understanding of constitutional principles, you're not what you appear to be. It was the second time that day someone had reached that conclusion. Maya's cover story was developing cracks that threatened to expose her true identity. What do you think I am? I think you're someone who understands injustice from personal experience. Someone who's seen the system fail people who look like you. Someone who decided to educate herself so she could fight back. The analysis was psychologically accurate, even if it missed her professional background. Maya had indeed chosen her career path partly because of personal experiences with systemic inequality. If that were true, would it matter? It would matter because knowledge without action is worthless. If you really understand how broken this system is, you have a responsibility to do something about it. Maya felt the weight of Wright's challenge. She was doing something about systemic corruption, conducting the most comprehensive investigation of courthouse operations in the building's history. But she couldn't reveal that without compromising 18 months of careful work. What would you suggest? Document everything. Pattern and practice, evidence of discriminatory treatment, statistical analysis of sentencing disparities, testimony from defendants who've been railroaded. Build a case that can't be ignored. Wright's suggestions described exactly what Maya had been doing for the past 18 months. Her federal investigation was accumulating precisely the kind of evidence he was recommending. And then what? Who would listen to a custodial worker with documentation of courthouse corruption? The right custodial worker with the right documentation could change everything. Civil rights organizations, federal investigators, media outlets, they all need credible witnesses with inside access. The conversation was taking on layers of irony that Maya found both amusing and frustrating. Wright was encouraging her to pursue exactly the investigation she was already conducting, using exactly the resources she already had access to. That's an interesting theory, Mr. Wright. It's more than theory. This courthouse has been operating as a conviction mill for decades. Someone with your knowledge and your access could expose the entire corrupt system. Maya nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his suggestion for the first time. I'll think about what you've said. But internally, she was thinking about timing. Wright's enthusiasm for reform suggested he might become an ally when her investigation reached its conclusion. The question was whether she could maintain her cover long enough to complete her evidence gathering. The legal consequences of Maya's confrontation with Detective Aldridge intensified when Judge Cassandra Blackwood decided to make an example of the uppity custodial worker who had dared to challenge police authority. Maya's arraignment was scheduled with unusual speed, less than 24 hours after her arrest. Most defendants waited weeks for initial hearings. But Judge Blackwood wanted this case resolved quickly and decisively. The charges were more serious than the incident warranted: assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, and criminal mischief. Each charge carried significant penalties, and their cumulative effect could result in years of prison time. Public Defender Iris Kane met with Maya in a holding cell 30 minutes before the hearing. Barely enough time to review the charges, let alone develop a defense strategy. Maya, I have to be honest with you. These charges are serious, and Judge Blackwood doesn't mess around. The prosecutor is recommending 18 months in state prison, which is actually generous considering the maximum penalties. Maya studied the charging documents with professional attention to detail. The police report was a masterpiece of creative writing, transforming her peaceful intervention into a violent assault on law enforcement. According to this report, I attacked Detective Aldridge with my fists and attempted to help a suspect escape custody. That's not what happened. I know, but it's your word against his. And juries tend to believe police officers over defendants, especially in cases involving assault on law enforcement. Kane's pessimism was professionally realistic but personally devastating. She genuinely believed Maya was innocent, but she also understood the mathematical certainties of the criminal justice system. What about the witnesses who saw the actual interaction? What witnesses? Detective Aldridge's report says you confronted him while he was alone with the suspect. No other witnesses are mentioned. Maya felt a chill of recognition. The dozen courthouse employees who had observed her confrontation with Aldridge had somehow vanished from the official narrative. Their testimony had been erased as efficiently as if it had never existed. There were at least 12 people watching when Detective Aldridge arrested me. Court employees, attorneys, defendants waiting for hearings. Someone must have recorded it on their phone. Kane's expression grew skeptical. Maya, if there were really that many witnesses, someone would have come forward by now. The prosecutor's office would have interviewed them. The police would have taken statements. Unless those witnesses were discouraged from coming forward. The implication was clear. Witness intimidation was standard operating procedure in cases that threatened the courthouse's power structure. Maya's arrest had triggered protective mechanisms designed to prevent exposure of systemic corruption. That's a serious accusation. Do you have any evidence of witness tampering? Maya realized she was approaching the limits of what she could reveal without compromising her investigation. Her knowledge of courthouse operations was based on 18 months of surveillance that couldn't be disclosed without exposing her true identity. Just observation and logic. When a dozen people witness an incident and none of them are mentioned in the police report, either they're being ignored or they're being silenced. Kane nodded slowly. It's possible, but proving witness intimidation would require evidence we don't have. Right now, we need to focus on defending against the charges as filed. The arraignment itself was a masterclass in judicial bias disguised as legal procedure. Judge Blackwood entered the courtroom with theatrical authority, her black robes flowing behind her like a symbol of absolute power. All rise. The Honorable Judge Cassandra Blackwood presiding. Maya stood beside her attorney at the defendant's table, studying Judge Blackwood with professional interest. She had observed dozens of the judge's hearings over the past 18 months, documenting patterns of discriminatory sentencing and procedural violations. Ms. Thornfield, you are charged with assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, and criminal mischief. Do you understand these charges? I understand the charges, Your Honor. I don't understand how exercising constitutional rights became criminal behavior. Judge Blackwood's eyes narrowed with irritation. Ms. Thornfield, you will answer the questions asked and refrain from editorial commentary. Yes, Your Honor. Prosecutor Whitmore approached the lectern with confident authority, presenting the state's version of events with practiced persuasion. Your Honor, the defendant interfered with a lawful police investigation, physically assaulted Detective Aldridge when he attempted to restore order, and resisted arrest while encouraging a suspect to flee custody. These actions represent a clear pattern of disrespect for law enforcement and legal authority. Maya listened to the narrative with clinical detachment. Whitmore's version of events was carefully crafted to maximize her culpability while minimizing any context that might explain her actions. How does the defendant plead? Judge Blackwood's tone suggested she expected a quick guilty plea that would end this embarrassing incident without further complications. Not guilty, Your Honor. Not guilty to all charges? Not guilty to all charges. Additionally, I request dismissal of all charges on grounds of prosecutorial misconduct and civil rights violations. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Defendants in Maya's position didn't typically challenge the charges with constitutional arguments. They pleaded guilty and hoped for mercy. Judge Blackwood's face reddened with barely controlled fury. On what grounds do you claim prosecutorial misconduct? Maya stood with calm authority, her legal training finally breaking through her custodial worker facade. Your Honor, Detective Aldridge arrested me for citing constitutional law to prevent civil rights violations. The arrest was retaliatory and therefore unlawful under the First and 14th Amendments. The precision of the constitutional analysis was stunning. Maya wasn't just claiming innocence, she was demonstrating sophisticated understanding of federal civil rights law. Furthermore, Maya continued, Detective Aldridge's police report omits material witnesses and misrepresents the sequence of events. This constitutes evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. Judge Blackwood's composure cracked visibly. Ms. Thornfield, are you a lawyer? No, Your Honor. I'm a citizen exercising my constitutional right to self-representation. Where did you acquire this legal knowledge? Maya had prepared for this question, but her answer would either reinforce her cover story or expose her true identity. Education is available to everyone, Your Honor. Constitutional law isn't proprietary information restricted to legal professionals. The next few minutes will completely change how you view this case. When the truth finally comes out, you'll understand why this judge's face went completely white. Stay with us and share this video with someone who needs to see that karma is real. The response was technically accurate but strategically incomplete. Maya had indeed educated herself about constitutional law through FBI training, law school, and federal law enforcement experience. But Judge Blackwood didn't need to know those details. Motion to dismiss denied. This case will proceed to trial. Bail is set at $75,000. The amount was deliberately punitive. For a custodial worker earning minimum wage, $75,000 represented several years of income. Judge Blackwood was ensuring that Maya would remain in jail until trial, where harsh conditions would pressure her into accepting a plea deal. Your Honor, I request bail reduction based on my employment history and community ties. Denied. Your behavior demonstrates a fundamental disrespect for authority that suggests flight risk. What behavior specifically demonstrates flight risk? Maya's question forced Judge Blackwood to articulate her reasoning, exposing the circular logic that governed the proceeding. Your interference with police operations, your resistance to lawful arrest, your attempts to undermine legitimate authority. Your Honor, citing constitutional law isn't interference, it's civic engagement. Requesting proper procedure isn't resistance, it's advocacy. Challenging unconstitutional behavior isn't undermining authority, it's defending the rule of law. Each response demonstrated legal sophistication that seemed impossible for someone of Maya's supposed background. Judge Blackwood's confusion was visible as she struggled to reconcile Maya's articulate defense with her assumptions about custodial workers. That's enough, Ms. Thornfield. Bailiff, process the defendant for transport. As Bailiff Steele moved to escort Maya from the courtroom, she made one final statement that would haunt Judge Blackwood's sleep for weeks. Your Honor, I respectfully note that Detective Aldridge's body cam footage from this incident has mysteriously disappeared, despite department policies requiring preservation of all use of force documentation. I also note that material witnesses to these events have been excluded from the prosecution's evidence. These omissions raise serious questions about the integrity of this prosecution. The comment landed like a bomb in the courtroom. Evidence tampering and witness intimidation were federal crimes that could trigger Department of Justice investigation. Maya had just publicly accused the court of participating in criminal conspiracy. Judge Blackwood's face went white with shock and rage. Remove the defendant immediately. But as Maya was led from the courtroom, she caught sight of several faces in the gallery, faces that showed curiosity rather than hostility. People were beginning to wonder who Maya Thornfield really was, and how a custodial worker had come to possess such detailed knowledge of constitutional law and federal criminal procedure. The answer to that question would soon transform everything. Knowledge is power, especially in the courtroom. Masterclass offers courses on law, negotiation, and civil rights from expert attorneys and judges. Learn how to protect yourself and your family from legal injustice. Visit masterclass.com and use code JUSTICE for 15% off your annual membership, because understanding the system is the first step to changing it. The federal investigation that Maya's arrest had triggered began with the precision of a surgical strike. Within 72 hours of her arraignment, agents from the FBI Civil Rights Division had established a command center in a downtown office building, 3 blocks from the Metro District Courthouse. Special Agent Catherine Wells reviewed the initial intelligence reports with the methodical attention of someone who had spent 15 years investigating systemic corruption. The Maya Thornfield case had activated automated federal monitoring systems designed to detect patterns of civil rights violations in local jurisdictions. The arrest report is fascinating, Wells told her partner, Agent David Reeves, as they studied the documentation. Custodial worker with sophisticated knowledge of constitutional law gets arrested for citing Miranda rights to a detective, then demonstrates advanced understanding of federal civil rights statutes during arraignment. Reeves highlighted sections of the transcript with professional interest. Either she's the most educated janitor in American history, or there's more to this story than appears in the official records. Wells nodded thoughtfully. Either way, her arrest has triggered mandatory federal review. Civil rights violations committed under color of law automatically fall under our jurisdiction. What Wells and Reeves didn't know was that Maya Thornfield's arrest had triggered more than routine federal review. Hidden protocols embedded in Justice Department monitoring systems had identified her true identity within hours of booking, alerting FBI Civil Rights Division Command that one of their own deep cover agents had been compromised. Agent Mitchell Bradford, Maya's federal handler, received the classified alert at 2:37 a.m. on a secure communication channel that bypassed normal bureau hierarchy. The message was brief but urgent. Operation Clean Sweep agent compromised. Immediate extraction recommended. Bradford stared at his encrypted phone with growing concern. Maya had been operating under deep cover for 18 months without a single security breach. Her custodial worker identity had been flawless, her evidence gathering comprehensive, her operational security impeccable. For her cover to be blown now on the verge of completing the most significant courthouse corruption investigation in Bureau history suggested either catastrophic operational failure or deliberate sabotage. He placed a secure call to FBI Deputy Director Sarah Morrison, waking her from sleep with news that threatened to derail years of careful investigative work. "How bad is it, Martin?" Morrison asked without preamble. Unknown. Agent Thornfield was arrested for interfering with a police investigation. She maintained cover during initial questioning, but her legal knowledge during arraignment raised suspicions about her background. Has she requested extraction? Bradford checked his secure messages. Negative. No communication since arrest. She may be maintaining operational silence to protect the investigation. Morrison was quiet for several seconds, weighing tactical options that would determine the success or failure of a multi-million-dollar federal operation. Continue surveillance, but don't extract unless specifically requested. If Agent Thornfield is maintaining cover voluntarily, premature intervention could compromise 18 months of evidence gathering. And if her identity is exposed, then we move to immediate arrest and prosecution mode. But until then, we let her play this out. The decision would prove more prescient than Morrison could have imagined. Maya's first full day in Metro County Jail provided her with unprecedented access to the systemic violations she had been documenting from the outside. The facility was a microcosm of the courthouse's discriminatory practices, where constitutional rights disappeared behind concrete walls and steel bars. Her cellmate was a woman named Rachel Sterling, arrested on drug possession charges that Maya immediately recognized as questionable. Rachel was white, middle class, and had been caught with prescription medications that technically belonged to her boyfriend. In a just system, she would have received probation and drug counseling. In this system, she was being processed toward a felony conviction that would destroy her career as a nurse. You really think you can beat these charges? Rachel asked during their first night together, her voice carrying the hopelessness that jail was designed to instill. I think the charges are constitutionally defective, Maya replied, choosing her words carefully. Detective Aldridge violated established procedure during arrest and investigation. Rachel studied Maya's face in the dim light filtering through their cell window. You talk like you really understand this legal stuff. Most people in here just hope their public defender shows up sober. Maya had spent 18 months observing the public defender system's failures from the outside. Now she was experiencing them from the inside, and the view was even more devastating than her surveillance had suggested. Constitutional rights don't disappear just because someone gets arrested, Maya said. The problem is that most people don't know what their rights are or how to enforce them. Over the following days, Maya found herself conducting informal legal education sessions in the jail's common areas. Women who had never heard of the Fourth Amendment learned about illegal searches. Defendants who had been pressured into guilty pleas discovered they had the right to trial. Inmates who had been denied medical care realized that deliberate indifference to serious medical needs violated the Eighth Amendment. The sessions didn't go unnoticed by the jail's administrative staff. Correctional Officer Dennis Murphy approached Maya during one of her impromptu constitutional law classes. You're causing problems, Thornfield. Inmates filing complaints, demanding lawyers talking about their rights. That's not how we run things here. Maya looked up from the legal notebook she had been sharing with other inmates. A notebook filled with precise citations of federal civil rights statutes. Education isn't a problem, Officer Murphy. It's a constitutional right. Turner v. Safely establishes that prisoners retain First Amendment protections, including access to legal materials and information. Murphy's face darkened with irritation. You're not in law school, Thornfield. You're in jail. There's a difference. The Constitution applies equally in both places. That's what makes it constitutional law. The response was delivered with such calm authority that Murphy seemed momentarily speechless. He had expected defiance or fear, not a patient explanation of federal legal precedent. But Maya's growing influence among the inmates was creating institutional problems that extended beyond Officer Murphy's authority. Inmates were no longer accepting guard harassment without question. They were filing formal grievances, demanding medical attention, insisting on proper legal representation. Maya had inadvertently started a small revolution in civil rights awareness. Justice doesn't always come easy, but it does come. If this story of truth triumphing over corruption inspired you, wait until you see our next video about a prosecutor who thought he was untouchable. Click that notification bell so you never miss these incredible stories. The situation escalated when Maya witnessed Correctional Officer Timothy Walsh assaulting a mentally ill inmate named Margaret Dawson. Dawson was in the throes of a psychotic episode. Confused and frightened, when Walsh decided that physical force was the appropriate response to her medical distress. Please, I need my medication, Dawson pleaded, her voice breaking with desperation and psychiatric confusion. You need to shut up and get back in your cell, Walsh replied, grabbing her arm with unnecessary roughness that would have constituted assault outside the jail's walls. Maya intervened with the same calm authority she had used with Detective Aldridge in the courthouse parking garage. Officer Walsh, Ms. Dawson is clearly experiencing a medical emergency. She needs psychiatric evaluation, not punishment. Walsh released Dawson's arm but turned his attention to Maya with predatory interest that suggested this confrontation had been anticipated. Mind your own business, jailhouse lawyer. Her constitutional rights are everyone's business. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, including deliberate indifference to serious medical needs. Estelle versus Gamble establishes that prison officials have a constitutional duty to provide adequate medical care. The citation was delivered with the precision of someone who had studied constitutional law professionally, not someone who had learned it from television or library books. Walsh's expression shifted from irritation to suspicion. How does a janitor know about Supreme Court cases? Maya realized she had made a tactical error. Her knowledge was becoming too sophisticated to maintain her cover story. But she couldn't retreat without abandoning Dawson to continued abuse. Constitutional law belongs to everyone, Officer Walsh. Knowledge doesn't require permission. Other inmates had gathered to watch the confrontation, their faces tense with anticipation. They had seen guards retaliate against prisoners who stood up for themselves, and they expected violence. Instead, Walsh seemed to recognize something in Maya's steady gaze that gave him pause. There was no fear there, no uncertainty. There was only the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how dangerous this situation could become for everyone involved. "We'll continue this conversation later," Walsh said finally, backing down from the confrontation. But Maya knew the reprieve was temporary. She had made herself a target by refusing to accept the arbitrary authority that governed every aspect of jail life. The guards would find another opportunity to reassert their dominance, and next time there might not be witnesses to deter them. That night, lying on her narrow bunk, Maya used encrypted hand signals to communicate with surveillance equipment she knew was monitoring the facility. Federal agents were watching, waiting, ready to extract her if her cover was completely blown. But extraction would mean abandoning 18 months of evidence gathering and allowing the corruption network to escape justice. Maya made a decision that would define the remainder of her investigation. She would maintain her cover as long as possible, using her time in jail to gather additional evidence of systemic violations while building toward the moment when her true identity would have maximum impact. The federal investigation expanded rapidly in response to Maya's arrest and the constitutional violations it had exposed. Agent Catherine Wells coordinated with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division to open formal pattern and practice investigation of Metro District operations. The legal foundation was solid. Title 42, United States Code, Section 14141, gave federal authorities broad power to investigate and prosecute systemic civil rights violations by local law enforcement agencies. Maya's arrest provided the predicate acts necessary to establish federal jurisdiction. Wells reviewed the preliminary evidence with professional satisfaction. "We have documented civil rights violations, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and judicial bias. That's enough to open full-scale federal investigation." Her partner, Agent Reeves, highlighted key sections of Maya's arrest documentation. "The body cam footage disappearing is particularly interesting. That suggests coordinated cover-up involving multiple agencies." Wells nodded. "And the witness statements that were excluded from the police report indicate systematic obstruction of justice. This isn't just one bad cop, it's institutional corruption." What Wells and Reeves didn't realize was that Maya's arrest had been anticipated and planned as part of her deep cover operation. Every constitutional violation, every procedural failure, every piece of evidence tampering was being documented by sophisticated federal surveillance equipment for eventual prosecution. Judge Cassandra Blackwood's emergency hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning that would transform the Metro District Courthouse forever. Word had spread through legal circles that the cleaning lady lawyer case was becoming a federal matter, drawing attention from civil rights organizations, media outlets, and Department of Justice officials. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering in the hallways and lobby. Local news crews had established positions outside the building, their satellite trucks forming a technological perimeter around what had become the epicenter of a constitutional crisis. Maya was transported from jail in shackles that seemed deliberately excessive for someone charged with misdemeanor offenses. The metallic restraints were a visual reminder of the power disparity between the individual defendant and the institutional authority arrayed against her. But as Maya entered courtroom 6A, something had fundamentally changed from her previous appearances. The energy was different, charged with anticipation that suggested momentous events were approaching. People weren't just observing a routine criminal proceeding, they were witnessing history. Judge Blackwood entered with her usual theatrical authority, but her confidence seemed forced, brittle. The federal attention her handling of Maya's case had attracted was creating pressure she hadn't anticipated. Civil rights investigations had a way of expanding beyond their original scope, examining patterns of behavior that might reveal decades of judicial misconduct. All rise. The Honorable Judge Cassandra Blackwood presiding. Bailiff Marcus Steele's voice carried its usual authority, but Maya detected subtle signs of institutional stress. Steele's posture was more rigid than usual, his movements more controlled. The courthouse's power structure was feeling federal scrutiny for the first time in its history. Maya stood beside Public Defender Iris Kane, who had spent the weekend reviewing federal civil rights statutes with an intensity that suggested genuine commitment to justice. Kane had realized that Maya's case represented something much larger than a simple assault charge. It was a constitutional test case that could reshape how local courts treated defendants' rights. Ms. Thornfield, Judge Blackwood began, her voice carrying forced authority, this hearing has been called to address several pretrial motions filed by your counsel. Are you prepared to proceed? Maya exchanged a glance with Kane, who nodded almost imperceptibly. They had spent hours preparing for this moment, crafting legal arguments that would expose the constitutional violations underlying Maya's prosecution. Yes, Your Honor, we're prepared to proceed. Kane approached the lectern with newfound confidence, carrying files that contained 18 months of evidence Maya had carefully guided her to discover. Your Honor, the defense moves to dismiss all charges against Ms. Thornfield on grounds of prosecutorial misconduct, civil rights violations, and systematic denial of due process. The motion was sweeping in scope, challenging not just the specific charges against Maya, but the entire prosecutorial framework that had generated them. Judge Blackwood's eyes narrowed with barely controlled irritation. On what specific grounds, Counselor Kane? Kane consulted her notes with professional precision that surprised everyone familiar with her previous courtroom performance. Your Honor, the evidence demonstrates a pattern of constitutional violations that renders this prosecution fundamentally unfair. First, Detective Aldridge arrested Ms. Thornfield in retaliation for her exercise of First Amendment rights. Second, material evidence has been destroyed or withheld in violation of Brady v. Maryland. Third, potential witnesses have been intimidated or excluded from official documentation. Each allegation was supported by specific legal citations and factual evidence that Kane presented with growing confidence. Maya watched Judge Blackwood's face grow increasingly pale as the scope of the constitutional violations became clear. Furthermore, Kane continued, the charging decisions in this case appear to have been influenced by Ms. Thornfield's race and socioeconomic status, constituting selective prosecution in violation of the Equal Protection Clause. Prosecutor Sterling Whitmore rose to object, but his usual confident authority was notably absent. The federal investigation had created legal complications that made defending the prosecution increasingly difficult. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is engaging in unfounded character assassination of dedicated public servants. Kane turned to face Whitmore directly, her voice carrying steel that hadn't been there during Maya's arraignment. Mr. Whitmore, are you disputing that Detective Aldridge's body cam footage from Ms. Thornfield's arrest has disappeared? Are you denying that 12 courthouse employees who witnessed the incident were excluded from the police report? Are you claiming that charging a custodial worker with felony assault for citing constitutional law represents equal justice under law? Whitmore's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. The prosecution's case is based on evidence and testimony from sworn law enforcement officers. Defense counsel's conspiracy theories don't change the fundamental facts. Maya felt a surge of tactical satisfaction. Whitmore's response was exactly what she had hoped for. Defensive, dismissive, and legally inadequate. He was painting himself into a corner that would make the eventual revelation of her true identity even more devastating. Judge Blackwood attempted to regain control of the proceedings with judicial authority that was beginning to sound hollow. The court will consider defense motions, but this proceeding will focus on the specific charges filed against the defendant, not broad allegations of systemic misconduct. Kane pressed her advantage with legal precision that suggested hours of careful preparation. Your Honor, the specific charges are inseparable from the systemic violations that generated them. Ms. Thornfield was arrested for exercising constitutional rights. She was charged with assault for defending herself against excessive force. She was denied equal protection because of her race and social status. These aren't separate issues. They're manifestations of a coordinated effort to silence someone who dared to challenge institutional authority. The argument was both legally sophisticated and morally compelling. Maya had coached Kane carefully, providing her with exactly the framework needed to expose the prosecution's constitutional defects without revealing the federal investigation that had documented them. Detective Rex Aldridge was called to testify in support of the prosecution's case, but his appearance on the witness stand revealed a man under severe stress. Federal scrutiny had transformed him from confident authority figure to defensive suspect in his own potential prosecution. Whitmore led Aldridge through a carefully rehearsed account of Maya's arrest that emphasized her alleged violence while minimizing the context that had triggered the confrontation. Detective Aldridge, can you describe the defendant's behavior during your interaction on the day of her arrest? Aldridge shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair, his eyes avoiding Maya's steady gaze. The defendant interfered with a police investigation, challenged my authority using legal terminology, and became physically aggressive when I attempted to place her under arrest. The testimony was technically accurate but strategically misleading, emphasizing Maya's actions while omitting the constitutional violations that had prompted them. Kane's cross-examination, however, would expose the weaknesses in Aldridge's account with surgical precision. Detective Aldridge, you testified that Ms. Thornfield challenged your authority using legal terminology. What specific legal terminology did she use? Aldridge's discomfort became more pronounced. She cited some court case about Miranda rights, claimed I wasn't following proper procedure. She cited Miranda versus Arizona, didn't she? And she was correct about the constitutional requirements for custodial interrogation. I was conducting a field interview, not custodial interrogation. Kane consulted her notes with professional confidence that suggested she knew exactly where this line of questioning was leading. Detective, the suspect you were questioning was 16 years old, correct? He was pressed against a wall, surrounded by adults, and being accused of serious criminal activity? That's standard investigative procedure. Standard procedure that requires Miranda warnings before interrogation begins? Aldridge's face reddened with frustration. The situation was dynamic. Miranda warnings weren't required at that point in the investigation. Kane turned to face the gallery, ensuring that her next question would have maximum impact on the observing crowd. Detective Aldridge, how many years of law enforcement experience do you have? 15 years. And in those 15 years, how many custodial workers have lectured you about constitutional law? Objection, Whitmore called out. Relevance? Sustained, Judge Blackwood ruled, but the damage was done. Kane had planted the suggestion that Maya's knowledge was too sophisticated for her supposed background. Detective Aldridge, you testified that Ms. Thornfield became physically aggressive. Can you describe her specific actions? Aldridge's account became increasingly vague as he attempted to justify his use of force against someone who had posed no physical threat. She moved toward me in a threatening manner. I perceived her behavior as potentially violent and responded accordingly. By slamming her against a concrete wall and handcuffing her with excessive force, I used reasonable force to effect a lawful arrest. Kane paused for dramatic effect, consulting her files with the precision of someone building toward a crucial revelation. Detective Aldridge, where is your body cam footage from this incident? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Everyone in the courtroom understood the implications of missing evidence in cases involving police misconduct. The camera malfunctioned during the arrest. Malfunctioned how, specifically? Aldridge's eyes darted toward Prosecutor Whitmore, seeking support that wasn't forthcoming. Technical failure. These things happen with electronic equipment. Kane nodded as if accepting his explanation at face value. Detective, how often do your body cam cameras experience technical failures? Objection? Relevance? Judge Blackwood was growing visibly uncomfortable with the direction of Kane's questioning. Sustained. Kane shifted tactics, approaching the witness stand with controlled intensity that suggested she was building towards something significant. Detective Aldridge, you've testified that no other witnesses observed Ms. Thornfield's arrest. Is that correct? That's what my report indicates. Your report, not your recollection. Aldridge's discomfort was becoming palpable. My report accurately reflects the situation. Kane turned to face the gallery again, her voice carrying throughout the packed courtroom. Detective, are you aware that 12 courthouse employees have provided sworn statements to federal investigators describing their observation of Ms. Thornfield's arrest? The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Whitmore shot to his feet with objections that couldn't drown out the significance of Kane's revelation. Objection! The defense is introducing evidence not in the record. Judge Blackwood's face had gone white with shock and growing panic. Sustained. The jury will disregard. But there was no jury, and the damage was irreversible. Kane had just revealed that federal investigators were actively examining Maya's case and had documented witness statements that contradicted official police reports. Aldridge's composure cracked visibly. I don't know anything about federal investigators. Kane smiled with satisfaction that suggested this had been her target all along. Detective, are you testifying under oath that you're unaware of the FBI Civil Rights Division investigation of this courthouse? Whitmore's objections grew increasingly desperate, but Judge Blackwood's authority to control the proceedings was evaporating in real time. Maya watched the systematic destruction of the prosecution's case with professional admiration. Kane had exceeded her expectations, using the evidence Maya had carefully provided to expose constitutional violations with devastating effectiveness. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. The moment that would transform everything began with what appeared to be routine court administration. Bailiff Marcus Steele approached Judge Blackwood's bench carrying a manila envelope marked with official federal government seals. "Your Honor," Steele said quietly, "this was just delivered by federal courier, marked urgent and requiring immediate judicial attention." Judge Blackwood accepted the envelope with trembling hands, her face already showing the pallor of someone anticipating catastrophic news. She broke the federal seals and extracted documents that would end her career and transform everyone's understanding of Maya Thornfield. The first document was a federal search warrant signed by Chief Judge Patricia Williams of the United States District Court. The warrant authorized immediate seizure of all courthouse records, computer systems, and communications relating to the prosecution of Maya Thornfield and 47 other defendants, whose cases showed statistical patterns of discriminatory treatment. The second document was a federal arrest warrant charging Judge Cassandra Blackwood, Detective Rex Aldridge, and Prosecutor Sterling Whitmore with conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, a federal felony carrying potential life imprisonment. But it was the third document that shattered reality for everyone in courtroom 6A. Maya Thornfield, official FBI identification and federal agent credentials. The photograph showed Maya in FBI dress blues, her shield clearly visible, her rank listed as Special Agent, Civil Rights Division. Her assignment, 18-month deep cover investigation of systemic corruption in Metro District Court operations. Judge Blackwood stared at the credentials with the expression of someone watching her entire world collapse in real time. The cleaning lady she had been prosecuting was a federal law enforcement officer with authority to arrest her for civil rights violations. "Your Honor," came a voice from the back of the courtroom. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." The speaker was Agent Catherine Wells, FBI Civil Rights Division, who had entered the courtroom with a team of federal agents during the document delivery. She approached the bench with professional courtesy that carried underlying steel. "Agent Wells, FBI Civil Rights Division," she announced for the court record. "I'm here to coordinate federal arrest warrants and evidence preservation." Maya rose from the defendant's table with calm dignity, her 18-month performance finally complete. When she spoke, her voice carried the full authority of the United States government. "Your Honor, my name is Special Agent Maya Thornfield, Federal Bureau of Investigation Civil Rights Division. I've been conducting an undercover investigation of civil rights violations in this courthouse for the past 18 months. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Spectators gasped, reporters frantically scribbled notes, and court staff stared in absolute shock at the transformation of someone they had dismissed as an educated cleaning lady into a federal law enforcement officer with power to destroy their careers. Maya reached into her jail-issued shirt and produced her official FBI credentials, the same ones Judge Blackwood had been studying moments before. The gold badge gleamed under the courtroom's fluorescent lights, a symbol of federal authority that outranked every local official present. "This courtroom is now under federal jurisdiction pending completion of our civil rights investigation." Agent Wells approached Maya with professional efficiency, but her words were meant for the entire courtroom to hear. "Agent Thornfield, are you secure?" "I am, Agent Wells. All surveillance equipment has been recording continuously throughout the investigation. We have comprehensive documentation of constitutional violations, evidence tampering, and systematic denial of due process." Maya turned to face Detective Aldridge, whose face had turned ashen with the realization that he had just committed perjury in front of a federal agent who had witnessed every event he had misrepresented. "Detective Aldridge, you testified under oath that no witnesses observed my arrest. You stated that your body cam footage malfunctioned. You claimed that my constitutional rights were respected during arrest and interrogation." Maya's voice carried the cold precision of someone who had spent 18 months documenting criminal violations by law enforcement officers. "I'm Agent Maya Thornfield, badge number 7421, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every word of your testimony was perjury committed in the presence of a federal officer. Every aspect of my arrest violated clearly established constitutional law. Every element of this prosecution constitutes criminal conspiracy under federal civil rights statutes. The systematic destruction of Detective Aldridge's credibility was devastating to witness. A man who had projected absolute authority minutes before was now cowering in the witness chair, facing federal prosecution for crimes he had committed against the very person he thought he was testifying against. Prosecutor Sterling Whitmore attempted to salvage the situation with legal arguments that sounded increasingly desperate. Your Honor, even if Ms. Thornfield is a federal agent, that doesn't change the fact that she interfered with the police investigation and assaulted Detective Aldridge. Maya's response ended Whitmore's career with surgical precision. Mr. Whitmore, I'm a federal law enforcement officer who intervened to prevent civil rights violations against a minor. Detective Aldridge had no probable cause for interrogation, provided no Miranda warnings, and used excessive force during arrest. Every action you've characterized as criminal behavior was actually law enforcement intervention to protect constitutional rights. She turned to face Judge Blackwood, whose authority had evaporated completely with the revelation of Maya's true identity. Your Honor, this prosecution was initiated in retaliation for my protection of civil rights. Every ruling you've made in this case has violated clearly established constitutional law. Your bail decisions, your evidentiary rulings, and your courtroom management have all demonstrated bias that constitutes denial of due process under color of law. The technical language was devastating because it was completely accurate. Maya wasn't making emotional appeals or moral arguments. She was citing specific federal statutes that Judge Blackwood had violated through her handling of the case. Agent Wells stepped forward with professional authority that filled the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, this courthouse is now the subject of active federal investigation. All personnel are required to preserve documents and electronic records pending review by federal authorities. Anyone who attempts to destroy evidence or obstruct this investigation will face additional federal charges. The announcement was both information and warning. The corruption network that had operated with impunity for decades was now facing the full investigative power of the United States government. Judge Blackwood attempted one final assertion of local authority. This is my courtroom, and I am the presiding judge. Federal agents have no jurisdiction over state criminal proceedings. Maya's response demonstrated exactly why her 18-month investigation had been so effective. Your Honor, federal civil rights statutes supersede state criminal law when constitutional violations occur under color of state law. Title 18, United States Code, Section 2. 4.2 gives federal authorities jurisdiction over any state or local official who willfully violates constitutional rights. Your handling of this case constitutes exactly that type of violation. The legal citation was delivered with the precision of someone who had spent years studying federal civil rights law, not someone who had learned it from television or library books. Furthermore, Maya continued, my undercover investigation has documented systematic patterns of discrimination in sentencing, evidence handling, and procedural compliance that constitute conspiracy to violate civil rights under RICO statutes. This isn't just about my case. It's about institutional corruption that has violated the rights of hundreds of defendants over multiple years. Agent Wells nodded to two federal agents positioned near the courtroom exits. They moved with practiced efficiency toward Detective Aldridge, whose fate had been sealed the moment Maya revealed her true identity. Detective Rex Aldridge, you're under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, perjury in federal proceedings, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The Miranda warnings that Aldridge had mockingly denied to Maya were now being read to him as he was handcuffed in front of the courtroom he had used as his personal kingdom of corrupt authority. Prosecutor Sterling Whitmore watched his colleague's arrest with the expression of someone calculating his own legal exposure. Federal civil rights prosecutions had a way of expanding beyond their original targets, encompassing everyone who had participated in systematic violations. Mr. Whitmore, Agent Wells said, approaching the prosecution table with professional courtesy, we'll need you to accompany us to our field office for questioning regarding your role in this prosecution. I strongly advise you to contact an attorney. The suggestion was polite but unmistakably a command. Whitmore's prosecutorial career was ending in federal custody, just as Aldridge's law enforcement career had ended in handcuffs. The administrative hearing that followed Maya's identity revelation was unlike anything in the Metro District Courthouse's history. Federal agents had transformed Judge Blackwood's chambers into a temporary command center, with evidence collection teams cataloging decades of case files and computer records. Agent Mitchell Bradford, Maya's federal handler, finally revealed himself to coordinate the massive evidence preservation operation that 18 months of planning had made possible. Agent Thornfield, Bradford said with professional satisfaction, Your undercover work has produced the most comprehensive documentation of systematic civil rights violations we've ever assembled. The evidence is sufficient to support federal prosecution of the entire courthouse leadership. Maya reviewed preliminary damage assessments with the clinical detachment of someone who had spent 18 months preparing for this moment. The statistical analysis is overwhelming. Sentencing disparities based on race, evidence tampering in cases involving minority defendants, systematic exclusion of witnesses who might testify favorably for the defense. Judge Blackwood's courtroom has been operating as a conviction mill with predetermined outcomes. Bradford nodded grimly. The Department of Justice is prepared to file federal civil rights charges against 15 courthouse officials, including Judge Blackwood, Prosecutor Whitmore, and Detective Aldridge. Additional charges are pending against Court Administrator Lila Fairwin and Bailiff Marcus Steele. The scope of the prosecution was unprecedented in federal civil rights enforcement. Entire courthouse operations were being dismantled and rebuilt under federal oversight. Public Defender Iris Kane, who had unknowingly become Maya's most important ally, struggled to process the transformation of her client into the federal agent who had been investigating the system she worked within. "Maya, Agent Thornfield, how long have you been planning this?" Maya's response reflected the complexity of an operation that had required years of preparation and months of execution. The FBI began monitoring this courthouse 3 years ago after receiving multiple complaints about discriminatory sentencing patterns. Statistical analysis confirmed systematic bias, but proving intentional discrimination required inside access that only deep cover investigation could provide. Kane shook her head with amazement and growing understanding. "That's why you knew so much about constitutional law. That's why you could cite specific cases and federal statutes. You weren't an educated custodial worker, you were a federal agent gathering evidence." "I was both," Maya corrected gently. "For 18 months, I worked as a custodial employee while documenting the constitutional violations that played out in these halls every day. The cases I cited, the procedures I referenced, all of that was part of building a federal case that could withstand appellate scrutiny." Kane's expression shifted from amazement to concern as she grasped the implications of Maya's revelation. What happens to the defendants whose cases were handled by this court? If Judge Blackwood was systematically violating constitutional rights, how many wrongful convictions might there be? It was the question that would define the next phase of federal intervention. Bradford consulted preliminary statistics that suggested the scope of necessary remediation. "Our analysis indicates that approximately 400 cases handled by Judge Blackwood over the past 5 years show statistical patterns of discriminatory treatment. The Civil Rights Division is prepared to review every conviction and provide appropriate relief." The number was staggering in its implications. 400 defendants whose constitutional rights had been violated, whose convictions might be overturned, whose lives had been damaged by systematic judicial corruption. Maya felt the weight of those statistics personally. Each number represented a person who had been failed by the system she had sworn to protect. "Agent Bradford, what's our timeline for victim notification and case review?" "The Department of Justice has established a civil rights restoration unit specifically for this courthouse. We expect the review process to take 18 months, with priority given to defendants currently incarcerated on potentially tainted convictions." Judge Blackwood, who had been silent since Maya's identity revelation, finally spoke with the broken voice of someone whose career and reputation had been destroyed in a single morning. "Agent Thornfield, may I ask why you chose custodial work as your cover identity?" Maya turned to face the woman who had spent weeks trying to destroy her, her expression carrying professional detachment rather than personal animosity. "Custodial workers are invisible in institutional settings, Your Honor. People speak freely around someone they don't perceive as a threat. More importantly, custodial staff have access to every area of the courthouse, including chambers, offices, and holding areas where constitutional violations typically occur." Judge Blackwood nodded with bitter understanding. "And you documented everything." "I documented everything that was relevant to federal civil rights violations, yes. Conversations about predetermined sentences, coordination between prosecution and court administration, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, all of it was recorded and preserved for federal prosecution." The systematic nature of Maya's evidence gathering was devastating in its thoroughness. 18 months of surveillance had captured not just individual violations but patterns of institutional corruption that reached every level of courthouse operations. Agent Wells approached with preliminary arrest statistics that demonstrated the scope of federal law enforcement response. "Agent Thornfield, we've executed arrest warrants for 12 courthouse officials. Judge Blackwood and Prosecutor Whitmore are in federal custody pending arraignment. Detective Aldridge is being held pending psychiatric evaluation. He suffered what appears to be a complete psychological breakdown when he realized the scope of his legal exposure. Maya nodded with professional satisfaction. The corrupt network that had operated with impunity for decades was finally facing accountability under federal law. What about the institutional reforms? The Department of Justice is implementing immediate oversight of all courthouse operations. Federal monitors will supervise judicial proceedings, prosecutorial decisions, and law enforcement activities pending comprehensive reform of court administration. The federal intervention was comprehensive, designed to prevent the kind of systematic violations Maya's investigation had documented. The federal prosecution of Metro District Courthouse corruption unfolded over the following months with the methodical precision that characterized major civil rights enforcement actions. Maya's 18-month investigation provided evidence sufficient to support criminal charges against 15 officials and civil rights remediation for more than 400 defendants. Judge Cassandra Blackwood's fall was swift and complete. Federal prosecutors charged her with conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, a charge that carried potential life imprisonment. Her sentencing hearing became a public reckoning for decades of discriminatory judicial conduct. U.S. District Judge Patricia Williams, presiding over Blackwood's sentencing, delivered words that would be quoted in legal textbooks for generations. Cassandra Blackwood, you were entrusted with one of our democracy's most sacred responsibilities, the impartial administration of justice. Instead, you transformed your courtroom into an instrument of oppression, denying constitutional rights to defendants based on their race and economic status. Judge Williams paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the packed federal courtroom. Your actions didn't just violate law, they poisoned the well of public trust from which all judicial authority flows. The damage you've inflicted cannot be measured in dollars, but in ruined lives and stolen years. Blackwood's sentence was 35 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole, effectively a life sentence for a woman in her 60s. Her judicial pension was forfeited, her law license permanently revoked, her legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the corruption of absolute power. Detective Rex Aldridge faced a different kind of justice. The psychological pressure of federal prosecution had triggered a complete mental breakdown that left him unable to stand trial. Federal prosecutors agreed to a plea arrangement that resulted in 15 years imprisonment in exchange for comprehensive cooperation with ongoing civil rights investigations. Aldridge's cooperation proved devastating to other members of the corruption network. His detailed confession implicated dozens of officers in evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and systematic violation of constitutional rights. The Metro Police Department found itself under federal consent decree, with every aspect of its operations subject to Department of Justice oversight. Prosecutor Sterling Whitmore's political ambitions died in federal custody. His sentencing hearing was a masterclass in the destruction of prosecutorial immunity. Federal Judge Thomas Harrison showed no mercy for someone who had weaponized the legal system against vulnerable defendants. Mr. Whitmore, prosecutors hold extraordinary power in our system of justice. That power comes with extraordinary responsibility to ensure fair treatment for all defendants, regardless of their background or circumstances. Judge Harrison's voice carried the moral authority of someone who understood the sacred trust Whitmore had violated. Instead of serving justice, you served your own ambition. You coordinated with corrupt officials to predetermine outcomes, denied defendants their constitutional rights, and participated in a conspiracy that treated the courthouse as your personal kingdom rather than a temple of justice. Whitmore received 28 years in federal prison, his law license revoked, his political career transformed into a federal criminal conviction. The man who had once prosecuted others for corruption was now serving time alongside the defendants he had railroaded. Court Administrator Lila Fairwind's role as coordinator of courthouse corruption earned her 18 years in federal prison. Her administrative authority had been used to manipulate schedules, influence jury selection, and ensure that corrupt officials could operate without oversight. Bailiff Marcus Steele received 12 years for his role in intimidating defendants and witnesses. His physical presence had been weaponized to maintain the fear that kept victims silent about constitutional violations. But the institutional consequences extended far beyond individual prosecutions. The Department of Justice implemented comprehensive reform of Metro District Court operations under federal consent decree that would last for at least 10 years. Federal monitors assumed oversight of all judicial proceedings, prosecutorial decisions, and law enforcement activities. New policies mandated videotaping of all police interactions, computerized tracking of evidence handling, and statistical monitoring of sentencing patterns to prevent discriminatory treatment. The courthouse itself was physically transformed. New surveillance equipment monitored all interactions between officials and defendants. Constitutional rights posters were displayed prominently in multiple languages. Federal civil rights attorneys maintained permanent offices to provide immediate intervention when violations occurred. Maya's role in the investigation became public knowledge through congressional hearings that examined the systematic failures her work had exposed. Her testimony before the House Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Crime and Federal Government Surveillance was broadcast live and viewed by millions of Americans. "Madam Chairman," Maya testified, "my 18-month investigation documented more than 300 specific instances of constitutional violations by Metro District Court officials. These weren't isolated incidents or occasional lapses in judgment. They were systematic practices designed to deny due process to defendants who couldn't afford adequate representation." Committee Chairwoman Representative Sarah Martinez pressed for details that would inform federal legislation. "Agent Thornfield, in your professional opinion, how widespread are the problems you documented in Metro District Court?" Maya's response reflected years of studying institutional corruption across multiple jurisdictions. "Congresswoman, the statistical patterns we identified in Metro District Court are consistent with Department of Justice data from similar jurisdictions nationwide. When local courts operate without adequate federal oversight, constitutional violations become routine rather than exceptional." Her testimony led to passage of the Civil Rights Restoration Act, federal legislation that expanded Department of Justice authority to investigate and prosecute systematic violations by local court systems. The victim remediation process became a model for civil rights restoration nationwide. The Federal Civil Rights Restoration Unit reviewed every case handled by Judge Blackwood's court over the previous 5 years, identifying patterns of discriminatory treatment that resulted in hundreds of conviction overturns. Maya personally participated in notification meetings with defendants whose convictions were being reviewed. These encounters provided closure for her investigation while offering hope to people who had lost faith in the possibility of justice. One meeting particularly stayed with her. Beverly Tucker, the woman she had met in jail charged with prostitution, learned that her conviction was being overturned due to procedural violations Maya's investigation had documented. "Agent Thornfield," Tucker said, tears streaming down her face, "I never thought anyone would listen to someone like me. When you stood up for that girl in jail, when you taught us about our rights, you gave us hope that maybe the system could be fair after all." Maya felt the emotional weight of Tucker's words, understanding that her investigation had accomplished something beyond criminal prosecution. It had restored faith in the possibility of justice for people who had been failed by the system. The community response to Maya's revelation was complex and evolving. Some residents expressed anger that they had been deceived by an undercover federal agent. Others felt vindicated that their complaints about courthouse discrimination had finally been taken seriously. Community meetings organized by civil rights organizations became forums for processing the trauma of systematic injustice and planning for institutional reform. Maya attended several of these meetings, listening to stories of people whose lives had been damaged by the corruption she had documented. "Why did it take 18 months?" asked Marcus Henderson, the teenager whose case Maya had first observed during her courthouse surveillance. "How many people got railroaded while you were gathering evidence?" It was a fair and painful question that Maya had wrestled with throughout her investigation. Marcus, building a federal case that could withstand appellate scrutiny required comprehensive evidence of systematic violations. If we had moved too quickly, corrupt officials might have escaped prosecution on procedural grounds. The 18 months of evidence gathering was necessary to ensure permanent reform rather than temporary disruption. Her answer was professionally sound but personally difficult. Maya understood that every day of her investigation had meant additional victims of the corrupt system she was working to expose. The media coverage of Maya's investigation and its aftermath became a national conversation about the balance between law enforcement effectiveness and civil rights protection. Major newspapers editorialized about the need for increased federal oversight of local court systems. The Washington Post's editorial board wrote, "Agent Thornfield's courageous investigation demonstrates that systematic civil rights violations can flourish in plain sight when local institutions operate without adequate oversight. Her work should inspire Congress to strengthen federal civil rights enforcement and ensure that constitutional protections are meaningful for all Americans, regardless of their background or circumstances." Maya's FBI career continued with a promotion to supervisory special agent in the Civil Rights Division, where she developed training programs for undercover investigations of institutional corruption. Her Metro District Court investigation became a case study in effective civil rights enforcement, taught at the FBI Academy and law schools nationwide. 2 years after Maya's identity revelation, the Metro District Courthouse operated under continued federal oversight with measurable improvements in constitutional compliance. Statistical analysis showed dramatic reductions in sentencing disparities and procedural violations. But Maya understood that institutional reform was a generational process, not a quick fix. During a visit to the courthouse for a federal monitoring review, she observed proceedings with the professional detachment of someone who understood both the progress achieved and the work remaining. The new presiding judge, appointed under federal oversight, was conducting hearings with scrupulous attention to constitutional requirements. Defense attorneys were receiving adequate time for preparation. Prosecutors were following Brady disclosure obligations. Police officers were providing complete and accurate testimony. Yet Maya also recognized that some problems persisted beneath the surface improvements. Institutional culture changed slowly, and the habits of discrimination were deeply embedded in systems that had operated with impunity for decades. During a break in proceedings, Maya encountered Iris Kane, now working as a federal public defender in the courthouse where she had unknowingly aided a federal investigation. "Maya, Agent Thornfield, seeing you here brings back so many memories. Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you hadn't conducted that investigation?" Maya considered the question with the perspective that time and distance had provided. "Iris, systematic corruption requires systematic intervention. If our investigation hadn't exposed these violations, they would have continued indefinitely. Hundreds more defendants would have been denied their constitutional rights. The culture of discrimination would have become even more entrenched." Kane nodded thoughtfully. "But there's still so much work to do. Federal oversight has improved things dramatically, but you can't change decades of institutional bias overnight." "No," Maya agreed, "you can't. That's why federal consent decrees last for years rather than months. Sustainable reform requires changing not just policies but the culture that implements those policies." Their conversation was interrupted by a young defense attorney who approached with the eagerness of someone seeking wisdom from experienced practitioners. "Excuse me, are you Agent Thornfield? I've studied your Metro District investigation in law school. Your work has inspired my decision to pursue civil rights law." Maya smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose work had influenced a new generation of legal professionals. "What's your name?" "Jennifer Walsh. I'm a first-year public defender here. I wanted to thank you for showing that individual action can create systematic change." Maya appreciated Walsh's enthusiasm while understanding the challenges she would face. "Jennifer, the most important lesson from the Metro District investigation is that justice requires constant vigilance. Constitutional rights aren't self-enforcing. They require people who are willing to stand up for them even when it's difficult or dangerous." Walsh nodded earnestly. "That's what I learned from studying your case. You risked everything to expose corruption that was hiding in plain sight." "I did my job," Maya replied simply. "Sometimes doing your job requires courage, but the real courage belongs to people like Iris here, who work within the system every day to ensure that justice is more than just an abstract concept." The conversation reflected Maya's understanding that her investigation was just one part of a larger movement toward institutional reform. Sustainable change required not just dramatic exposures of corruption, but daily commitment to constitutional principles by everyone who worked within the system. 3 years after the Metro District investigation concluded, Maya received a secure communication that suggested her work had uncovered something much larger than local courthouse corruption. The message came through encrypted federal channels that indicated involvement at the highest levels of government. "Agent Thornfield, your presence is requested for a classified briefing regarding national security implications of the Metro District investigation. Report to FBI headquarters. Classification level, eyes only." Maya arrived at FBI headquarters with professional curiosity about what national security issues could connect to local courthouse corruption. The briefing was conducted in a SCIF, sensitive compartmented information facility, with security protocols that suggested information at the highest classification levels. Deputy Director Sarah Morrison led the briefing with the gravity of someone discussing threats to national security. "Agent Thornfield, your Metro District investigation identified communication patterns that extend far beyond local corruption. Computer forensics analysis of seized courthouse records has revealed encrypted communications with similar court systems in 12 other states." Maya studied the classified documents with growing amazement. What she had investigated as local institutional corruption appeared to be part of a coordinated national network. The communications suggest systematic coordination of discriminatory prosecution practices across multiple jurisdictions. This isn't just institutional bias, It's organized conspiracy to deny civil rights on a national scale. Morrison highlighted sections of intercepted communications that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Code names, coordination protocols, statistical targets for conviction rates based on demographic characteristics. Agent Thornfield, you didn't just uncover courthouse corruption. You discovered the operational center of a nationwide civil rights violation network. The revelation transformed Maya's understanding of her investigation. The 18 months she had spent documenting local violations had actually exposed systematic violations occurring across the entire country. What's our next step? Morrison's response indicated the scope of federal law enforcement response that Maya's work had triggered. Operation Justice Restored, a nationwide civil rights investigation coordinated by the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. 15 field offices, simultaneous execution of federal search and arrest warrants, comprehensive review of court systems in states where we've identified coordination patterns. Maya felt the weight of realizing that her undercover work had revealed something much larger than anyone had anticipated. Deputy Director, how long has this coordination been operational? Morrison consulted classified intelligence assessments that painted a disturbing picture of systematic civil rights violations. Our analysis suggests at least 15 years of coordinated activity. Systematic denial of constitutional rights, statistical manipulation of conviction rates, coordination between prosecution and judicial offices to predetermine outcomes. Agent Thornfield, this represents the largest civil rights conspiracy in American history. The briefing continued with details that revealed the national scope of systematic violations Maya's local investigation had accidentally exposed. Court systems from California to Florida had been coordinating discriminatory practices through encrypted communications networks that federal investigators were only now beginning to understand. Agent Thornfield, we're offering you operational command of the Justice Restored investigation. Your Metro District work demonstrated exactly the kind of systematic approach needed for this type of complex civil rights enforcement. Maya considered the opportunity with professional excitement and personal apprehension. Leading a nationwide civil rights investigation would be the capstone of her career, but it would also require years of commitment to exposing violations that might extend to the highest levels of government. I'll need operational independence and direct access to Justice Department leadership. Done. You'll report directly to the Deputy Attorney General with authority to coordinate federal resources across multiple jurisdictions. As Maya left FBI headquarters with her new assignment, she reflected on how her 18-month courthouse investigation had evolved into something that could reshape civil rights enforcement nationwide. But even as she prepared for the massive investigation ahead, she couldn't shake the feeling that the violations they had uncovered represented just the visible portion of a much larger pattern of institutional corruption. That night, as Maya reviewed classified intelligence about the nationwide coordination network, she received an anonymous message through secure channels that would haunt her for months. Agent Thornfield, congratulations on your promotion, but be careful who you trust in Washington. The corruption you discovered in Metro District Court reaches much higher than anyone realizes. Some of the people who will be supervising your investigation may be part of what you're investigating. Maya stared at the message with growing unease. If the anonymous source was correct, her nationwide investigation might be compromised before it began. The question was whether she could identify the corruption quickly enough to prevent it from destroying the largest civil rights investigation in American history. The message concluded with a final chilling warning. They know you're coming, and they've been preparing for this much longer than you realize. Maya deleted the message according to security protocols, but its implications would influence every aspect of her investigation planning. If corruption had indeed reached the highest levels of federal government, then even her promotion to lead Operation Justice Restored might be part of a larger strategy to control and limit her investigation. As she prepared for sleep, Maya's mind was already working tactically on how to conduct a federal investigation that might be compromised by the very institutions that were supposed to be supporting it. The Metro District Courthouse investigation had been complicated by local corruption. Operation Justice Restored would be complicated by the possibility that federal corruption was protecting the violations she was trying to expose. But Maya had spent 18 months as an undercover federal agent gathering evidence against corrupt officials who thought they were untouchable. She was prepared to spend however long it took to ensure that justice was more than just an abstract ideal. It was a practical reality for all Americans, regardless of their background, circumstances, or the power of those who sought to deny them their constitutional rights. The scale of the challenge ahead was daunting, but Maya understood that systematic injustice required systematic response. Her work in Metro District Court had been preparation for the larger battle that lay ahead. a battle to ensure that the Constitution's promises of equal justice under law were meaningful for every American citizen. 3 years after walking into a courthouse as Maya Thornfield, custodial worker, she was preparing to lead the largest civil rights investigation in American history as Special Agent Maya Thornfield, FBI Civil Rights Division. The cleaning lady who had challenged institutional corruption was about to become the federal agent who would determine whether American justice was truly blind, or whether the scales had been rigged by those with the power to tilt them in their favor. But that investigation, with its national implications and constitutional consequences, would be another story for another time. For now, it was enough that one courthouse in one city had been transformed from an engine of discrimination into a functioning temple of justice, and that hundreds of defendants who had been failed by the system had finally received the constitutional protections they had always deserved. Maya Thornfield had kept faith with the oath she had sworn as a federal agent, to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies of constitutional rights weren't foreign terrorists or domestic criminals. Sometimes they were the very officials who had sworn the same oath she had taken, then chosen to violate it for personal gain rather than honor it through public service. Her investigation had proven that one person, armed with courage and commitment to justice, could indeed make a difference. But it had also proven that individual action was most effective when it was part of larger systematic efforts to ensure that constitutional rights were protected for everyone. The Metro District Courthouse was no longer a symbol of institutional corruption. It was a symbol of what became possible when people refused to accept injustice as inevitable and chose instead to fight for the constitutional principles that defined American democracy. Maya's 18-month investigation was complete, but the work of protecting constitutional rights for all Americans would continue as long as there were people willing to stand up for justice, even when it was difficult, dangerous, or thankless. That was the lesson of the cleaning lady who became an FBI agent. And that was the lesson that would inspire future generations of Americans to ensure that liberty and justice truly were for all. The courthouse clock struck 5 p.m. as Maya walked through the same door she had entered 18 months earlier. This time, she wasn't carrying a custodial card or wearing a work uniform. She was carrying a federal badge and wearing the authority of the United States government. But the mission remained the same, ensuring that justice was more than just a word carved in stone above courthouse doors. It was a living promise that required constant vigilance and courage to fulfill. Maya Thornfield had fulfilled that promise, and in doing so, she had proven that American justice, when properly administered, truly could be blind to everything except the law itself.